So, welcome everyone to the second webinar in the Early Learning Network's Spring Webinar Series. I'm Hsueh, and I am the Director of the Nebraska Center for Research on Children, Youth, Families, and Schools at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. And I'm the Principal Investigator along with Dr. Lisa Knoke for the Early Learning Network lead. I am very excited to have you here with us today for the second installment of our four-part biweekly series that brings to you experts from across the country to share research findings from the network and highlights policies and practices to help children maintain early learning success during the critically important period from pre-kindergarten to third grade. Today, we're going to explore family engagement, an important theme across many of the early learning network studies. Our presenters will share insights and information to help us gain a deeper understanding of the link between family engagement and positive outcomes for children, families, and educators, as well as activities that parents and caregivers can do at home to promote early learning success. I do have a few housekeeping items, though, to cover first. Let me start by saying that this webinar is being recorded and it's streamed live on our Facebook page. A video of the presentation then, along with the slides and other resources, will be available on our website by next week. You can also find details about upcoming webinars at earlylearningnetwork.unl.edu. And because there's so many of you on the call today, which is very exciting to us, we did unfortunately have to mute you, but we do in fact want to hear from you. So please, let us know what you're thinking. Let us know what kind of questions you have, and do so throughout this presentation by using the formal Q&A, the function in the Zoom software. We will have a formal Q&A period after the formal presentations today. So please submit your questions using that Q&A button, okay? It's much better for us to be able to monitor the questions, keep track of them, organize them, and make sure we address as many of them as possible. That Q&A feature will help us prevent questions becoming lost. You can certainly use the chat box to engage in dialogue throughout the webinar. We do encourage you to share your thoughts and observations there, but do submit your questions through the Q&A function. Now, if you're joining us on Facebook, you can submit your questions in the comment section of the Facebook live video. Right now, as we're getting started, I invite you to use the chat to tell us a little bit about yourself, your name, where you're located, a little bit about your role in the early childhood and education space. And lastly, you can access closed captions by clicking the CC button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. In a minute, I'll turn things over to today's co-presenters, but first I want to give you a brief overview of the Early Learning Network and its mission. The nationwide Early Learning Network was established in 2016 and is funded by the Institute of Education Sciences. Our mission is to work collectively to advance the understanding of policies and practices that narrow the achievement gap and maintain early learning success as children transition from pre-K to elementary school and beyond. The network consists of 5 research teams, 1 assessment team, and a network lead team. Our research teams are studying children's transitions from pre-K into kindergarten and beyond in communities across multiple regions of the country. And we range from rural to urban locations. And we have representatives, children and families, representing various racial, ethnic, and linguistic backgrounds. Here you see a map showing where our teams are located in different parts of the United States. MDRC and the University of Michigan are conducting a study in the Boston Public Schools. The Ohio State University, their study is gathering data across the state of Ohio. The University of Nebraska-Lincoln is conducting a study in rural and urban parts of Nebraska. The University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill's sample is in rural North Carolina. And the University of Virginia is conducting their work in Fairfax County, Virginia, which is a diverse county in Northern Virginia. The University of California, Irvine is conducting a unique assessment study. They are developing and piloting a technology-based classroom observation system known as OLOS. And you'll learn more about that at our webinar scheduled for early June. As you know, today's conversation is focused on family engagement. There's strong evidence that family engagement with early childhood programs in schools is key to children's healthy development and early learning success. We're going to hear what the network is learning about family engagement and identify some policies and practices that may help strengthen family-school partnerships, particularly during that sensitive period, that transition period from pre-K to kindergarten. So how do family-school partnerships change over time? And how can we build consistently strong relationships across pre-K and the early grades? How can we empower parents and caregivers to take an active role in their child's education and offer enriching activities and interactions at home to support learning and development? Well, today we're excited to welcome two researchers from the Early Learning Network who will share their research insights and offer recommendations to address these questions in their joint presentation, Home and School-Based Activities to Support Student Success. As a reminder, please use the Q&A button and not chat to post your questions. This will allow us to stay apprised of and address the questions as they come up. Again, the chat feature can certainly be used for other purposes, and we encourage that, including interactive dialogue and resource sharing throughout the entire webinar. So now I'm pleased to introduce Doctors Amanda Witte and JoAnn Hsueh, who each bring a wealth of research expertise and experience in understanding the role of families and family school connections in young children's learning and development. Dr. Amanda Witte is a research assistant professor at the Nebraska Center for Research on Children, Youth, Families, and Schools at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. Dr. JoAnn Hsueh is Director of Family Wellbeing and Children's Development at MDRC, a nonprofit social and education policy research organization based primarily in New York City. So now I'll turn things over to Amanda to begin the joint presentation, which will be followed by discussion and reflection and time for your questions.
Okay, so as Sue said, I am from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, and I will be talking today, but I'll be representing the work of all of our team that we've done together. And I'll be talking about a couple of different studies that we've conducted here in Nebraska. So, I think I can advance. Okay, so to set up what we'll be talking about today, I wanted to break down family engagement into three different dimensions. So we're really thinking about different ways of conceptualizing family engagement because it's not just one thing. So I'll be talking a little bit about home-based involvement, school-based involvement, and parent-teacher relationships. So if we think about activities that families can do, there are things that they can do in the home environment to promote their children's learning, things they can do in the school environment like volunteering and being present. But then also we'll focus quite a bit in my talk today about parent-teacher relationships, which are a really important aspect of family engagement. And so thinking about family engagement, as Sue mentioned earlier, we already know a lot about family engagement, and we know a lot about the positive benefits of family engagement. So for our studies, we wanted to dig a little bit deeper and find out how family engagements can vary due to context or how they may change over time. So we wanted to dive a little bit deeper into what things like environment and children's age and then relationships over time and how they impact children and children's outcomes. So I know the last seminar really focused on the transition from pre-K to kindergarten. So I'm going to hopefully extend some of the messages that they shared. And as I talk about transitions from pre-K through early primary grades, but really focusing in on that family engagement component. And the part of the reason why this comes up is that these transitions are really important for children's growth and development. So as we make that transition from pre-K into elementary school, this is a really sensitive time period that can set the stage for future growth and development, especially when it comes to family engagement. So that's part of the reason why we're spending so much time talking about it. we do love maps, so I wanted to share the map of our research site. So I think one of the things that's unique about the study that we've done here in Nebraska is that we were able to collaborate with a wide variety of communities all across the state. So we have larger urban centers in the eastern portion of the state, as well as smaller rural communities really spread across the state from the northwest to the central and to the southwest. So just wanted to give you a picture of where all of our partners are coming from. So first, I want to talk about parent-teacher relationships and student outcomes. So as we were thinking about it, we know there's some good connections between parent-teacher relationships as one of those dimensions of family engagement. And our first question was a straightforward one. So how do the immediate effects of parent-teacher relationships relate to children's, and we are particularly thinking about children's social skills and problem behaviors. So those things that are really critical, important for children's growth and development and academic outcomes over time. And so we look to see in preschool as well as kindergarten and first grade, when the teachers have a good relationship with the parent, how does that relate to social skills and problem behaviors for those kiddos while they are in that grade? And we found that yes, teachers' positive perceptions of their relationships with parents during the school year predicted the children's social skills, so positive social skills, but also predicted fewer problem behaviors. So we're seeing that good connection that when parents and teachers have a good relationship during the school year, we see good outcomes for children. Right? So that's sort of a snapshot within time, those concurrent effects. But we're also really interested. So as you know, when kids move from grade to grade, they get new teachers. And we wanted to look at the cumulative effects of relationships, the parent-teacher relationships over time. So we asked, do sustained parent-teacher relationships across that whole pre-K through first grade time period, does that predict children's social skills and problem behaviors? And what we found was yes, that having that sustained parent-teacher relationship, so even though the children and the parents stay the same, the teacher is changing, but we're finding that when parents and teachers have good relationships over time, we see that sustained relationship predict improved social skills as well as fewer problem behaviors. So really the key takeaways here are we're finding interesting things that not only do parent-teacher relationships matter in the moment, but they can have cumulative sustained effects over time. So continuing that good parent-teacher relationship practices as children grow and develop can remain really important. So that's sort of one aspect of things that we wanted to talk about. Then we wanted to break down and look at some of those other aspects of family engagement and how they may grow and change over time. So let's take a look at our home-based involvement. And for this study, we looked specifically at just the pre-K to kindergarten transition. And we wanted to see what do home-based involvement and school-based involvement, how does that change as children grow and develop over time? And so we looked to see that at the start of the fall and the pre-K year, we saw that parents engaged in home-based involvement activities, but we saw those activities increase both over the course of the pre-K year, but then continued to increase as the children entered into kindergarten. So by the end of the kindergarten year, we saw that continued trajectory of increasing home-based involvement. And this is for both urban and rural communities, I should say. Now, the pattern looks a little bit different for school-based involvement. So what we saw here was that from the beginning of pre-K to the end of pre-K, we did see an increase in school involvement. So parents were increasing their involvement with their children's education in those school-based activities. But then we did see a decline by the end of kindergarten. So we saw they went up a little bit and then it went down. So they reduced their school-based involvement by the end of kindergarten. Now, we also wanted to dive into parent-teacher relationships, and we wanted to take a look specifically at a really important aspect of parent-teacher relationships, communication and different types of communication, and see what those patterns look like over time. So we took a look at structural communication. So this is their exchanging of information, some concrete conversations. And then we also looked at relational communication. So this is really about how the parents and teachers view their partnership or talk about their partnership and their affective work together. And so here we saw for structural communication, that exchange of information, we saw that decline from the beginning of preschool to the spring of kindergarten. But the relational communication, we saw that looked a little bit more like school-based involvement, that trajectory there. So we saw increase from the fall of pre-K to the spring of pre-K, but then that decreased back down by the end of kindergarten. So seeing some intriguing patterns about parent-teacher relationships and home and school-based involvement as children progress from pre-K to the end of kindergarten. So then we wanted to see, what about that influence of context? So we know that schools and communities differ on a number of factors, and we wanted to see what relationship does community have in terms of family engagement. So as we talked earlier, when we looked at our map, we did have the pleasure of working with a variety of communities. So we took a peek to see how schools or how parents and family engagement might vary based on whether or not they live in a rural or an urban community. And so again, we took a look at home-based involvement, so those learning activities that happen at home. And here we did see a significant difference between urban and rural. In fact, we saw urban families engaging in more home-based activities than our rural families. And then similarly, we also saw our urban families participate more in school-based activities than our rural families, though in both cases, the home-based activities were higher than their school-based involvement. So then similarly, we took a look at those parent-teacher relationships, in particular the communication that parents and teachers together. And here we saw similar patterns in that we saw our urban families engaging in more structural communication and relational communication relative to their rural counterparts. So a couple of thoughts that we had about that. We were thinking about, what might be influencing these outcomes that we saw. So we're hypothesizing that perhaps changes in program structure and expectations from pre-kindergarten to kindergarten may be influencing those changes in relationships. So as the rigor of academics increases as children get older and move into kindergarten, perhaps that's impacting how parents are involved. And then classes get bigger, so teachers have more children that they are working with and more parents and families that they're engaging with. And so it's possible that that's influencing some of that family engagement. And then thinking too about what might be different in urban and rural communities that could be impacting some of their engagement and relationships. And so thinking about some differences in the physical environment, the infrastructure, perhaps relationship expectations. If you think about the resources that are available in urban versus rural communities, perhaps things like libraries or other activities that are available to communities, this certainly would differ by urban and rural. So we're thinking about other potential barriers in rural communities that might prevent parents from providing some experiences at home. And maybe also thinking about there are perhaps some cultural or contextual expectations about what it means to be a parent and to be an engaged parent in school. And perhaps there are some differences between the urban and the rural communities in that sense. So I think I went really fast, but I did want to get to my practical implications. And so just sort of our take-home messages here are that family engagement is vulnerable to changes over time. So we see as children move through that pre-K into the primary grades, we do see some changes. So being aware that the engagement can change and can look different can help us promote better family engagement. It's also important to think about that they may look different in different communities, right? So there's certainly no such thing as one size fits all when it comes to family engagement. Then we want to make sure that we're tailoring our approaches and making our suggestions in ways that make sense for our different communities. But the other really key practical implication to think about is that these are things that we can affect, right? So we can influence relationships, and now we know those relationships have strong impact on children's outcomes right in the moment, but also the cumulative impact over time as children grow. So if we think about some recommendations, continuing to prioritize relationships, even when it gets hard, right? Like, so as class sizes increase and academic rigor increases, keeping relationships at the forefront of the work that we do and keeping family engagement a priority can have really strong impacts for children as they grow. And then also finding ways to identify learning experiences that can be available to all families, regardless of their infrastructure or various resources that are available to them. But really making clear the importance of the role that families play in education. So given what we know about the benefits of family engagement, thinking through these subtle differences and how they change over time and by community can be really important. But the main thing is that we continue to make it a priority and make it an important part of our approach. Okay, I think that is what I had. So I will stop sharing and turn it over to JoAnn.
Great, thank you, Amanda. Let me get my slides up as well. Okay, so is everybody seeing them? Okay, great. So today I'll be talking about some of our insights from our work with Boston Public Schools pre-K program. And really one of the things that we'll be focusing on primarily, while Amanda talked more broadly about the different types of family engagement activities that one could study and one could also think about promoting, the work that we're doing with Boston Public Schools really tries to dig in deeper to unpack the types of family-based home-based activities that parents may be engaging in with their kids and what the implications might be for early learning while in preschool and pre-K. Oh, interesting. Okay. I thought we was gonna have a similar problem. Okay. So this sounds great. So one of the things that I'd like to just start out by saying is, Boston Public Schools is, a well-renowned pre-K program. And one of the things that underscores kind of its approach to instruction in the pre-K year is this underlying philosophy around the different types of skills that children can be developing throughout the pre-K year, as well as they move through early elementary school. And it really focuses on this kind of conceptualization that we think about, that there are different skill domains. So there's language and literacy and math, among others. And within each of those skill domains, there's also kind of what we call constrained and unconstrained skills. So constrained skills are those types of skills that children may eventually learn and kind of have a ceiling or a cap. So this could be the letter identification, early word identification. In math, that may be understanding basic numbers, simple subtraction and addition problems. And then there may be also these unconstrained skills, which are skills in these skill domains that may be more can continue to grow and foster over time. So this might be language and literature, this might be vocabulary, this might be reading comprehension, this might be kind of like differential understanding, conceptual knowledge around math and how that relates to other kind of concepts in other domains. And so when we think about then the home-based kind of learning activities that parents may be engaged in, one of the questions that we're really interested in is, are there differential types of activities that families might be engaging in at home to promote learning? And do those different types of activities kind of have equally influential kind of implications for children's early learning? And so here what we are showing is that, you can perhaps dig deeper and kind of unpack that black box of kind of activities, home-based learning activities, to kind of think about how they might differentially promote different types of skills. So here we think of constrained language and literacy skills as kind of showing children how to read a book, basic letter identification, simple words, whereas unconstrained skills in the language and literacy domain activities might be about reading the books, asking children to extend that story and connect it to the world around them. Similarly, in math, you can think about a similar sets of skills, activities that might be focused on these different skills. So in the constrained and math area, you might focus on number, things that you can see physically and touch around in the world around you, while as the unconstrained math skills might broaden to kind of promote children's deeper thinking, understanding, conceptual knowledge. So you might talk more about relational kind of aspects of number, talk about other concepts there. So in the research questions that we're really aimed at trying to address, we break this down even further. So we're really trying to understand, do parents engage in these different types of learning activities at home? So home constrained and unconstrained language and literacy and math learning activities at different rates. And do these rates or engagement in these activities vary with parents' education levels? We also want to look at how these different types of learning activities at home might differentially predict children's gains in different skill domain areas across the pre-K year. And does this association vary for different, with parents with different education levels? So our sample in Boston Public Schools is a economically, racially, ethnically, and linguistically diverse sample. The study sample is in the blue bars, and this just shows how it compares with the overall sample that we were, overall student population of pre-K kids in the Boston Public Schools. So there are some differences, though generally we kind of mirror the racial and ethnic and linguistic and economic diversity. The differences that we see in our study sample versus the larger public school sample likely has to do with how we selected schools to participate in the study. So just to go a little bit further into what our sample looks like. So the parents in our sample also have varying levels of educational attainment. And in general, it's a fairly highly educated sample. About 45% of the sample have at least a 4-year college degree or higher. And so this allows us to really unpack how families with different types of educational backgrounds might engage in differential activities and how that might link with children's outcomes. So one of the things that we first start out looking at is just kind of base rates of what parents report engaging in different types of activities at home. So here you see the bars of language literacy constrained, math constrained, language unconstrained, and math unconstrained. And so what you see is that parents report kind of the highest level of usage of language unconstrained skills. So this is reading books, extending storytelling, those kinds of things. And the scale here is 1 is never, whereas 4 is they report doing it 5 or more days per week. So 2 is between 1 and 2 days a week, and 3 is between 3 and 4 times a week. So that kind of gives you an idea of kind of the overall levels that families are engaging in these types of activities. So when we try and unpack that further and kind of look at who is engaging in different types of activities and how does this vary with parents' education levels, what we do see is that we don't see many differences between the literacy constrained and math constrained activities by parents' education levels. So these differences are not statistically significantly different. Whereas what we do see is that parents' engagement, reported engagement in different types of language unconstrained activities and math unconstrained activities do vary with their levels of education. So here we see that parents with advanced degrees report engaging in language unconstrained activities more frequently than those that do not. And we also see the reverse, though, is that parents who with at least a high school diploma or less education do report engaging in math unconstrained activities to a higher degree. So then when we want to kind of begin to look at how does engagement in home unconstrained learning activities predict children's skill gains in different domains across the pre-K year, what we do see is that parents who report higher levels of unconstrained language activities does significantly relate to the gains that their children make in vocabulary during the pre-K year. And similarly, we also see that parents who report engaging in more unconstrained math activities also links with predicted gains in children's math skills during the pre-K year. What we don't see is crossover. So we don't see that unconstrained language skills at home link with children's math skills, and vice versa. Unconstrained math activities at home link with children's vocabulary. However, we don't see that when parents report using more constrained learning activities, so teaching direct language and literacy skills in math and in literacy. So here are some examples, like focusing on letters or sight words or a number or simple addition and subtraction. We don't actually see that predicting children's gains in language and math skills during the pre-K year. So then when we try and look at how do these associations kind of vary when, depending on parents' education levels, what we do see is that families where parents do not have a college degree versus parents that do have a college degree tend to show a higher increased gains in children's vocabulary across the pre-K year when parents report doing more unconstrained language activities. So this is for, as you can see here, the dashed line indicates the gains, the predicted gains for in children's vocabulary skills from the beginning of the year to the end of the year when parents do not have a college degree. And the green line shows it for those who have at least a college degree. So you can see that there is crossover in these lines, and very much so reported engagement in unconstrained learning literacy activities at home does seem to be closing much of the disparity that we do see at the beginning of the year. Similarly, when we look at unconstrained math activities, we see a very similar set pattern of findings here as well, where we see for those who do not have a college degree, who report doing more engagement in unconstrained math activities at home, this does seem to be more beneficial in children's gains across the pre-K year as well. So the thing that we can't tell with these findings is there might be other factors that obviously could contribute to why certain parents are engaging in math unconstrained activities and literacy unconstrained activities versus not. And we, in our data, can't unpack that further. So just turning to kind of what might be some key implications of these findings, I think, as I mentioned when we started this, one of the key hopes that we were trying to understand is really unpack the type of activities that families might be engaging in learning activities at home. And what we do find is that it does seem to matter the types of activities that families engage in at home with children's gains over the year. So implications of that may be that it may be important to kind of acknowledge that fact and also recognize that these types of unconstrained learning activities at home may be an important thing to promote. So in many ways, when parents have kind of constrained time, as many working parents do and many parents do, that, you know, there's an acknowledgement that these home-based learning activities can be fun and interactive. They obviously can reflect the cultural and linguistic diversity of families much more so. They don't necessarily have to duplicate what is being also taught in the pre-K programming, and that may essentially benefit kids. And so from there could be things that districts can actively do to promote these different types of learning activities. So examples of this might be that in Boston Public Schools, for example, there's a Homeschool Connections newsletter that kind of gives parents ideas of unconstrained learning activities, both in language and literacy and in math that families can be doing at home. And this may be particularly important in the area of math where families are less likely to kind of engage in those activities on their own. Similarly, districts can also identify kind of materials at homes that can be used in these activities. So when you're thinking about, families may not have good examples of what they could be using. And so fostering that creativity is also another way that districts can continue to support families and children in home-based learning activities. And so I just want to acknowledge my co-authors in this work. I obviously want to acknowledge Boston Public Schools and Jason Sachs and his work as well. And that is it. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much, Amanda and JoAnn. Those are really excellent presentations, and really makes us think about the shared responsibility of promoting children's learning and development from the early years beyond and really throughout education. We think a lot about what happens in classrooms and what teachers do and how they interact with students and how they select curricula and assess progress and things like that. Clearly all really important. Critical things that need to be happening to encourage children to achieve to the best of their potential, but we sometimes forget about that other really important resource and that other important context where learning occurs, all those out of school hours and all those beyond school connections and relationships that children have that really can help achieve that shared goal that we all have, and that is to help children, make gains and sustain their gains over time. So really lots of food for thought, lots and lots of food for thought. In fact, we heard people, we heard two presentations that really focused on a similar theme, but took it in a really different direction, with JoAnn talking a lot about what parents can do, how they interact with their children in language and math related areas, and how the nature of the interaction that parents have with their children predicts the kinds of outcomes that we're all interested in. But then we heard Amanda talk about not just what parents can do and often do in terms of their home-based and school-based involvement, for example, but also that connection, that homeschool connection, the partnership and the communication that happens between home and school, and how really important that is to promote a learning from pre-K and not just in the immediate sense, but that cumulative effect of that connection between home and school and how that really bolsters learning over time. We talk a lot, again, about getting parents involved, right? Getting parents engaged. But what Amanda's reminding us of is the importance of keeping parents engaged. So lots of food for thought, and we want to hear what your questions are and your thoughts too. It's a really great opportunity for us to sort of now engage in some joint dialogue. So please do submit your questions. We already had some questions coming in, the Q&A button at the bottom of the Zoom screen. If you're on Facebook, please put your comments in the comment section of the Facebook Live video. And we'll go ahead and start entertaining those questions now. So I'm going to try also to switch screens here for just a minute so that I can hopefully engage a little bit better. So of course, lots of people are interested in recommendations, right? The now what kind of question. Now that we're you're piquing our interest and our curiosity about this really important aspect of children's learning. How do we begin to translate that into practice? How do we translate that some of these findings into strategies? So I'm going to start with you, Amanda, because there was a question that came in early on as you were talking about your recommendations. And the question has to do with how we do translate these recommendations into practice. So for example, some of the recommendations you gave are things like, the importance of considering context, in particular community context, as we're working to engage families. You also talked about encouraging parents, that parent-school connection, family-school connection over time. How can we take the rural-urban sort of contextual reality into account when we're recommending strategies for family school connections?
Sure. Yeah. So I'll start at sort of a systems level, right? Like, so I want to take it way back, and then I can talk about specific things that parents and teachers do. But I think one of the things that I've seen most successful is when schools and communities really think about family engagement from the broadest of levels, right? So we think our schools, especially here in Nebraska, are really good about thinking systemically and systems wide about academic things, right? Like, so we've done a really good job of doing things like setting up our schedules to ensure that we have time in the daily schedules for the children who need intervention to receive intervention without missing key core instruction. And we have good resources for providing professional development to teachers and administrators on things like reading and math, and even social emotional skills to a certain extent. So what I would promote here from a systems level is really making family engagement a key component at that higher level. So ensuring that our administrators and our teachers do have time within their day to connect with parents and have time to invest in relationships with families. And then also ensuring that as a part of their curriculum and their studies, that there are activities that then can be conducted at home that connect the learning that they're doing at school, right? So if one of the assignments that goes home in their daily folder that goes back and forth between home and school is the parents ask the child, what was the favorite thing that you did today? Or how did, I know that you're learning about insects. What insects do you see in our backyard that might connect with what you're learning at school? So making sure that it's built into the daily practice, I think, can be the most effective. Then another thing that I think one of the lessons that we can learn is that our preschools do a really good job of this. So why not, let's connect with our preschools, our preschool administrators and our preschool teachers, find out what's effective in their community at the preschool level, and then how can we push that up then into kindergarten and beyond in an appropriate, a developmentally appropriate way, but really taking the lessons that we learned, because if they are working, they're working in that community, in the rural community. Now let's extend them beyond. So that was a really long-winded answer, but I think if we can take it, really build it into the way that we do business as a school. Of course, that's hard. And there still needs to be practical tasks that we can do, but building it into the way that we do business is where we see it be most successful.
Good. Okay. Just a follow-up question to you, Amanda. There's been a question about measures. And actually, I'm going to start with Amanda, but I'm going to transition to JoAnn because I know both teams are really concerned about measurement in all of early childhood research, right? But this area in particular is kind of a thorny one when it comes to measurement. So what measures are you using in your research, particularly related to family school relationships and perceptions that parents and teachers have about one another, and that sort of the relationship between parent and teacher?
Yeah, so the ones that we talked about today were survey measures. So we use the Parent-Teacher Relationship scale, and that's a measure that both parents and teachers complete. I think today I mostly reported on the teacher perception of it. So it's a measure that asks them about different ways that they interact. It asks them how they view one another, but it is a paper and pencil survey measure.
So that's the communication data that you shared came directly from that, at least that, some of the data came from that measure.
Yes. Yeah.
But also some of the just general relationships, how they feel about their sort of affective connection that they have with one another. Okay, parent-teacher relationship scale, excellent. And the authors of that are Harlan Vickers and Kathleen Minke. If anybody is interested in that, we can share resources too after the seminar as we send things out to folks. We will be sharing resources. So if anybody else has ideas on measures, please put that in the chat box because we can share that and distribute that more broadly after the fact. JoAnn, what measures do you all use for the family school and parent engagement?
So we don't have so many measures of family school specifically, that perceptions of the relationship with the teacher. But what we do have is more nuanced measures about the types of activities that families might be engaging in, learning activities at home. And that really is a combination of drawing from existing survey measures, as well as creating some additional new measures that kind of build off of kind of activities that we might be seeing in school, but then also trying to translate it at home. So it is kind of a hybrid of taking some existing measures and adding some new ones in there as well. To get at this more, these different types of dimensions of home-based learning activities. And that really comes from the fact that, you know, there has been kind of in the field much more thought about these kind of basic skills. So like a lot of home-based learning activity measures are like, how many books do you have? It doesn't necessarily go into like, what do you do with those books with this nuance, right? So I think that that's just really an interesting development for the field, and I think pushing a new direction. So it's fun.
Good, thank you. There's a question about what many will describe as quote unquote hard to connect families. How do we connect with families for whom there's a disconnect in terms of where schools are at, you know, in terms of their general approaches and where families are at that moment? This particular question is particularly getting at families who think that education is the school's responsibility, right? But there's also families who don't speak English, who might be in this country as migrant families, whom for other kinds of personal or maybe their own historical background reasons haven't necessarily been successful at connecting with their children's teachers or educators. What are your thoughts about how we might begin thinking about and reaching out and connecting with those kinds of with those families is how I like to phrase it. And I don't mean those families. I'm catching myself now in terms of the language that I'm using, but really how do we connect with families for whom there has been challenges because of disconnects across the school system and the family system as, you know, entities of their own.
I can start, and then JoAnn, if you want to jump in. So I think it takes time and it takes patience, but I do firmly believe that all families can have positive relationships and can have positive engagement with schooling. So sometimes what that means is thinking creatively about who's the best person to connect with, right? Like, so perhaps it's not just one person, right? Like it doesn't just have to be the mom, right? Like we can identify a variety of family members who spend time with the child and engage with them in making those connections. I do understand, especially so I am from rural Nebraska communities, I understand that there can be challenges in perceptions of what is the role of the parent and what is the role of the school. And I do think it takes some time, but one of the ways that we can start to frame this is that oftentimes in those communities, the school is a really important aspect of the community. So finding ways to connect with parents when they are at the school for a basketball game or for voting or for all of the other things that happen at the school that aren't necessarily school, taking advantage of those opportunities. The other thing too, I think if we get to a place where there really is conflict in the relationship or big challenges, really finding ways to identify some common goals. And it could be the case that, you know, for some families, going to college is not their goal for their child, right? And so finding ways to identify what it is that's really important to those parents, how school can support it, and how their work together, their partnership, can really result in the best outcomes for children, regardless of what those goals are. So finding common goals and finding ways to collaborate towards meeting those goals. Was that too vague and abstract? What do you think? Investing time in relationships.
I thought that was great. Amanda. I mean, I think one of the things that's so powerful about your data in Nebraska, really being able to map those relationships and how they change over time, is that it also really points to the fact that, you know, while families might have different conceptions around, you know, school's responsibility and families' responsibility around children's education, that it doesn't always start out that way. And so it kind of really speaks to like early learning, pre-K is kind of this unique environment where families do kind of start out being engaged in school and kind of looking for that. And I really like your data because it speaks to like that's a moment where you can kind of build and foster expectations, leveraging on the fact that families are already engaged. So like when we think about the transition to K, it can be about also getting families ready for the transition to K and kind of like what to expect and what they can advocate for, and kind of supporting that engagement already, and then continuing to support it as they move through. So I think that that's like one of the things that's really beautiful and powerful. Like you hear about in like Head Start moving to the transition to K. There's a lot of work around working with the families to kind of say, okay, your child's going to kindergarten now. Here's like a set of transitions, but we kind of don't do that in public school. So even though they're making the transition from pre-K to kindergarten, we don't foster and nurture that. We kind of assume, well, they're in the same school, so it should stay the same. But you know, obviously, families' expectations really change over time. And I find that fascinating.
Well, and I appreciate you saying that, JoAnn, because just 2 weeks ago, our previous webinar and Facebook Live event had to do with transitions, and alignment, right across that, you know, period from pre-K to kindergarten and beyond. And we talk a lot about transitions and alignment in classroom structure and the way we interact with students in that environment, even curricular kinds of things, what specific things we are teaching children even, and whether there's redundancy or, you know, big gaps, you know, in things that we're expecting students to do. But rarely do we hear people talk about transitioning the family, right? And bringing that family along, and whether it's helping them understand how best they can engage with their child at home through this, you know, stimulating, nurturing interaction where we're, you know, engaging in conversation and these unconstrained kinds of skills and strategies that you talked about, or whether it's transitioning the relationship.
Yes.
As new teachers are introduced to that family, as Amanda talked about, you know, the importance of really that sustained notion that parents are partners and parents are, children do best when their parents are engaged at home, as you've talked about, and also in that family school connection. Really important messages. I'm kind of putting that out there because I'm hoping that there's some policymakers in the audience and practitioners. And I was going to ask both of you, okay, in your last minute now, what's the one message you want them to know? What is that sort of takeaway that you really hope our practitioners, policymakers, decision makers, and even fellow researchers in the audience today bring with them? I threw mine out there, so that was mine. What about the two of you? What do you think would be maybe one takeaway that you really hope people will leave today with?
I'll say, I think family engagement, it gets you a lot of bang for your buck. So I think you can really, this is a thing that we can control and a thing that we can really invest in. There are a lot of things that are outside of our control, like pandemics. So if we really take a moment and capitalize on what we can do, I think we can really see huge payoff down the road.
Great. It's malleable. It's malleable, which is one of the things the network is about, identifying malleable factors that matter for kids. JoAnn, how about you?
Identifying malleable. Yes. You know, I really, I think there is a lot that we can be doing more to really think about the different types of activities that families can be doing at home, and really capitalizing on that. That, you know, obviously kids spend a lot of time at home, and, you know, if we can continue to promote those activities that foster those skills in children, I think it has the added benefit as well.
Awesome. Great. Thank you both so much. Really great conversation today. And thanks to everybody in the audience who are presenting some questions and connecting with us and chat in other ways. So in closing, we are out of time. So We will invite you to register for the next webinar. We have 2 more that are upcoming on May 18th. We'll be focusing on diversity, equity, and inclusion in early learning. We'll be examining systemic and instructional factors to promote more equitable opportunities and outcomes for children of color. Clearly important topic, not only for the entire field, but even in terms of this notion of family engagement. Really important piece of what we need to be considering in our work as early childhood educators. And then on June 1st, we'll discuss assessment and observation tools to help practitioners individualize instruction. I mentioned OLOS earlier, and we'll hear from that team. More information can be found by checking us out at earlylearningnetwork.unl.edu. And finally, as I mentioned earlier, a recording of today's webinar and the slides and additional resources will be available on our website very soon. So we encourage you to download our educator practice guide on engaging families during the pre-K to kindergarten transition. You'll find it and many, many other tools and resources on our website. And a link will also be posted in the chat right now. Please do take a look at the website, the Early Learning Network website, where you will find a wealth of information about the various studies that are occurring, not only the work around families, but all of the different questions that are being asked and findings that are really in the moment, hot off the press. Information about what the teams are doing and what we're all learning can be found there. Pay attention to our social media accounts. We have Facebook, we have Twitter. We are very active in those spaces, and we want to hear from you. We want to engage with you. We want to interact with you. So follow us, we'll follow you, and we'll continue this discussion going forward. Thank you very much to everybody for joining us today. Really enjoyed the conversation, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Take good care. Bye-bye.